Hello, hello, hello! I am Phylum. Welcome to my stream. For those of you who are new to the stream, what we are doing here is we are playing some Plague Inc., and we are doing so without evolving because that is the way that God intended for mutations to occur. But beneath the surface, this is all just an excuse for me to talk about things that I want to talk about, and today we are talking about the topic of authenticity, which I find to be something that is a little hard to define. So, as we get into it, I want to first start by saying we are starting in India for this round. So, yeah, no evolving, but what we will do is we will randomize our starting location based on how populated certain regions are. So the more populated a region is, the more likely it is to be chosen. You can see the data pinned in the comments. And I'll just let this go on as background noise as I begin to talk about what I'm really interested in talking about. And again, yeah, that's authenticity. So the topic of authenticity was brought up to me recently by a friend who was recalling the story of this person that was very proud to claim their own authenticity, like very proud of the fact that they did not listen to what other, didn't act the way that other people wanted them to act, like making sure that he knew that she was the type of person who didn't listen to nobody, acted very quote unquote real. And for some reason that kind of hit me in a weird way, right? Because I conjure the image in my head of somebody who is the type of person to say, I just say it like it is, followed by something very hurtful or preceding something very hurtful, right? So I don't think that the definition of authenticity is sufficiently described by just doing whatever the heck you want. So the other reason why it struck me as kind of unusual to be so proud of this fact is this idea of, should you be authentic, or in what context should you be authentic? Should you be authentic in every context? Being familiar with Asian culture, I have often heard that there are several different faces that you have. One face that you show to the public, one face that you show to the people that are close to you, and the face that only you know. Basically, what all of that amounts to meaning is who you are is context sensitive, right? You are not the same, you do not act the same in every context that you exist in. That would be nuts, right? Like you wouldn't talk to your parents the same way that you talk to your boss, or at least I think you wouldn't. For the most part, you wouldn't talk to your parents the same way that you would at least talk to your friends, or your very like close friends, unless your parent is your close friend. Again, context shift. So the idea of living authentically, I think, cannot be captured just by saying I act the way that I want to all the time, because, it's not safe to act the way that you want to all the time. Does that mean you are betraying who you are as a person? It's kind of hard to tell, right? So it got me thinking about what the research defines as what authenticity is. So by diving into the research, I think that would give me something to play with in my head to sort of figure that out for myself, right? So I want to first state here, before I get too much further into discussing this topic of authenticity, I am not a mental health care professional. I am not a doctor. I am not a therapist. I'm not a psychologist. I am a biologist. And so everything that I'm about to talk to is from a kind of amateur perspective, right? I picked up the paper, I read the paper. Did I understand every single facet of the paper? No. But I think with my training, I understand enough of it to kind of get the gist of what they're saying. So I picked up this paper and the link is in the description. Unfortunately, it's paywalled, which is a bit of a bummer, and I don't know how I feel about making paywalled material available to the public. I don't want to, get in any kind of trouble. So you'll just have to take my word that this is about to be a faithful summary or a faithful summarization of their conception of what it means to be authentic. So I'm going to pop this image up. So authenticity, right? Let's pivot here. So this model of authenticity is divided into 3 parts that are all in some level of communication with each other, right? So there is this idea that there is a real you, some quasi-objective truth to you as a person. And the second part is your own awareness of the real you. So if you've ever heard about anybody saying that they feel like they don't quite know themselves, that's speaking to a level of awareness of who you are truly. And then the physical, so the behavior and the emotion that result from your perception of who you are. So between these 3 conceptions of self are some interactions, basically. So the distance between the real you and your awareness of the real you can be defined as self-alienation. So if you ever feel like you're not fully in tune with who you are, you could describe yourself as having been through some level of self-alienation. So beyond that, between the awareness of the real you, your cognitive understanding of who you are as a person will then feed into your outward manifestation of your own behavior, right? So, and emotion, right? So between your own awareness of who you are as a person and what you do and feel, that gap or that interaction, you could call authentic living, right? So if you are true to yourself, then you would be acting in a way that is in line with what you understand yourself to be. And this so far only lies within a vacuum, but we all know that our identities are not in a vacuum, right? We are social creatures. We exist in a social environment. And so the third leg of this model is this idea of environment, and this idea that environment can influence your feelings of self-alienation and your feelings or whether or not you are authentically living. And so this gives us a couple of different things or ideas to play with, right? Like, if we accept that this is a sufficient model for what authenticity is based off of, then we might be able to measure certain aspects of how authentic one is being. So again, the definition that I was brushing up against is this overly simplistic idea that, oh, if you're authentic, then you only do what it is that you want to do, which I think is, again, too simple of an idea. If authenticity is broken up into these different components, then we can more closely examine each individual component and get something more useful than just do whatever the heck it is that you want to do. Because what if the person that I am is authentically someone who wants to keep the peace, who doesn't want to actually incur on others, who feels bad about being intrusive or occupying space? That could be who I am authentically. And if I act in that way, does it look like I'm truly not like asserting my will? It gets kind of messy. So the authors of this paper seek to develop a questionnaire or a scale that allows you to measure aspects of this idea of authenticity. And then what they also did is that they took those values, those measurements of authenticity, and related them to things like the big 5 personality traits, as well as satisfaction with life, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, that's basically this conception of authenticity. So I'm going to let that like marinate in chat for a while I go back to Plague Inc. for a hot second and fill in some data. So let's get back to this. So we have been defeated. No surprise there. I am going to fast forward and then record that data. So I want you, chat, to think a little bit about what authenticity meant to you and whether or not you agree with this particular conception of authenticity, right? If something in that trifecta, the idea that there's a real you, the idea that there is your own understanding of the real you, and there's this idea that you are listening or acting in a way that is consistent with the real you. Because I think that this is a pretty powerful way to divide your own conception of self. But as we'll find out a little later on in the stream, I'm not entirely sure if it is consistent, or there might be some things that you might have to take with a little bit of a grain of salt. Okay, so that is the replay done. I am going to record this round. 17127 17127 192 192. So not a very good run by any stretch of the imagination. Next up, we are going to be starting in China. Yeah, so if we weigh it by population, you're going to see a lot of starting in China or starting in India. And we're off to the races once more. Okay, so there's this idea that authenticity can be divided in certain subcategories or can be broken down as a measure of certain other things. And this group of researchers wanted to create a scale that would be able to measure that level of authenticity and maybe use it for other people down the line. Maybe it becomes something useful like a clinical tool to help people identify with certain feelings or whatever. But again, I'm not a mental health care professional, so I'm not going to have too much input as to the practicality or the validity of this. I'm more interested in just reflecting on the idea of authenticity in a strange way, or in a different way, I should say. So even though I don't think I can show the paper, what I do think I can do is show you the questions, because the questions are published in a paper that is public or freely available. So I don't feel too bad about showing this, and I've like remade the questions so that it's a little more convenient to look at anyway. So it should be not a problem. So we'll take a look at this. So on the screen is the author's scale for authenticity. And so the way that this works is that you would get these questions and they would, I'm cheating a little here, right? When you get these questions, they're not going to be divided into easily understandable categories, right? You're going to get them in a random order so that you're not particularly biased in answering one way or another. But this is essentially what they're measuring: authentic living, accepting external influence, and self-alienation. So the idea is that you can measure authenticity by measuring these three subcategories. So I'm going to give you all a chance to answer these for yourself. And so the scale is 1, does not describe me at all, and 7 describes me very well. And I'll go ahead and answer them in line, and I don't know, we can compare or whatever. But I think these are really interesting, reflective questions that even if you don't buy into this idea that authenticity can be measured in this way, at the very least, these are interesting questions that you can use to reflect upon your own lived experience, which I think is still useful, right? So the first question is, I think it is better to be yourself than to be popular. I'm going to give that a 6. I think it's very important to be yourself. Popularity can be useful, I would say. I don't think it's sufficient or necessary for a happy, life, but it doesn't hurt to be well liked by people. So that's why I've demoted it from a full score of 7 back down to a 6. Let's see. It's a nice lens to examine authenticity through, and the researcher's definition also ties in with the broader idea that the authentic expression of influenced by what is appropriate to your environment. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, yeah, we live in a context. You can't just always be doing whatever the heck you want, right? That I think, I mean, I guess you could call that authentic, but it's not a useful way to think of authenticity, right? So, number 2, I always stand by what I believe in. I'm going to give myself a 4 for this. So, I think that I have morals that I think are hard to live by, or I think that there is this ideal expression of morality, or some level of ideal expression of morality that exists for me personally, like what my conception of my ideal self would be. And do I live up to that standard every day? I don't. I'm okay with that. I've accepted that. That wasn't actually always true back when I was in stem cell high school. I think when I was younger, I was much more idealistic, right? I had a lot more conviction in my belief of what is right and wrong. And after you live for a while, you begin to understand that morality it's sticky, it's kind of messy, and again, very heavily context-based. I used to think that people that said that, morality is complicated were too cynical. I was very much a person that thought, oh, if everybody in the world thought exactly like me, the world would be better off. That's how sure I was in my own conviction. But now I think I have a healthy level of respect for what I am capable of as a human cell. But also, my standards for what I consider to be my own values have also been adjusted, I think, to what I am capable of. So it kind of works both ways. Number 3, I am true to myself in most situations. So I think that this is very hard to answer. It's kind of vague, but I think a lot of these psychology studies are purposefully vague. So it's not so much that there is an objective answer to this for every person. It's more like, what is the feeling that you get, or what does it make you reflect on? And I would say that in most situations, I would find it hard to not be true to myself in most situations. But then again, my life is no longer dominated by things like peer pressure. And so I find it to be quite easy to be true to myself in most situations. So I'm just going to give myself a full 7 for that. I live in accordance with my values and beliefs. Again, to me, that's very similar to number 2. I'm going to go with a 4. For example, I would love to be a vegan. I would love to be a vegan. I think that morally, that's just correct, right? But what keeps me from being a vegan is I am unwilling to sacrifice certain vices or certain conveniences. I am unwilling to pay a higher premium to be a vegan. That's not to say that I haven't made strides to this goal. I eat primarily a plant-based diet. I just haven't fully gotten there, right? So that's an example of me understanding that I have this ideal version of myself, and I'm just going to accept them. I'm a little short of it, right? So I'll wait for chat to fill this authentic living bit and take some time to really think about what it means to live authentically for them. And I'm going to record some Plague Inc. data. It would have been smart if I had played this replay while I was talking about authentic living, but I guess I can just move on to the next section. So, accepting external influence. So this is what I was referring to by we don't live in a vacuum. You can't just do whatever the heck you want. there has to be nuance when it comes to acting in a way that is acceptable. We have, there's this concept, right? The Freudian concept of id, superego, and ego, right? And if you just acted on id all the time, that doesn't necessarily make you a better or happier person. The self is a lot more complex than just listening to your instincts or basal desires, right? So part of who you are is your level of tolerance or acceptance of external influence. And I think that's a brilliant way to put it. Because yeah, sometimes society tells you to do stuff that you don't want to do and it sucks. But also sometimes society tells you what to do and you either don't care or you think that it's fine. So that is, I think, why this three-pronged model of authenticity is more, can capture more about the human experience than just, do whatever the heck it is that you want to do. Okay, so I'm going to record this data, 63876. 63876 So that also looked like a pretty low run. Yep, not even 1% of the world unalived. Okay, so we go next. By 28, and we will begin in Canada. All right, Canada, let's do this. Good luck, Canada. All right, so accepting external influence. So I am going to do this one as well. So one, I am strongly influenced by the opinions of others. So this one to me is a little complicated. Like, I don't necessarily think that other people's opinions don't influence how I think. I am, because you could interpret this as being open-mindedness, right? But you could also interpret it as being how strongly do you stick to your guns, basically. And so I think I split the difference. I do think that one of the things that I think that I want to be or should be is open-minded. And so the idea of integrating other people's thoughts and opinions into my own, I'm going to rate myself at about a 4. Like, I think that I have some flexibility here. Number 2, I usually do what other people tell me to do. This one's, again, pretty tough because I feel like people generally tell me to do things that I'm okay with doing. Like, I don't have an opposition. I'm at a stage of my life where if somebody tells me what to do, it's usually because I'm at work and I need to do something. I need to bring home a paycheck, and so I will do the thing that they ask me to do. So, again, not being in an environment where peer pressure is such a huge influence on me, it makes it really hard to tell if how I would be influenced by peer pressure. I guess I feel no desire to be on TikTok for the sake of chasing trends. I'm achronistic. I don't know. I'm old. I'm old and I'm unable to keep up with trends to begin with. Maybe if I were younger and if I had a more of a pulse, more of a finger on the pulse of pop culture, maybe I would be more influenced by what others are pressuring me to do. But I think that in the spirit of the question, I'm going to have to rate myself a 2. I don't think I usually give in to other people's demands of me if it is something that I truly don't care to do. Number 3, I always feel I need to do what others expect me to do. So this is slightly different than number 2. This is more about the urge or the thought process behind whether or not to accept an external influence. I would rate myself a little higher here. I give myself a 3 just because part of who I am is someone who, again, wants to keep the peace. And number 4, other people influence me greatly. I don't think that is true for me in particular. So while I do update my thoughts and opinions, I very much think that I maintain a handle of who I am as a person. I don't think I regress to any kind of mean in terms of the population that I hang out with, so I'm going to give myself a 2 for that one. And now the final category, I think the scariest category to think about, is the category of self-alienation. So, I don't know how I really feel inside. This used to be true for me, I think before I got therapy. Because, believe it or not, you know, the person that you are watching on this stream, I would say that I am scientifically minded, and in the past, I believe that I have taken that to an unhealthy extreme. I don't know if that describes any of you, chat, but certainly for me, there was a point in time where I was so afraid of my own ability to experience negative emotion that I convinced myself that it is better to just logically process everything than it is to feel anything, because my lived experience was that when people showed extreme emotion, the outcomes were generally negative, right? Outbursts of anger lead to violence or hurt feelings. And so I was so afraid of becoming that emotional person that it got so bad where in therapy, when my therapist asked how I felt about certain things, I was actually unable to find the words. I would describe what I was feeling, right? Because my therapist asked me how I was feeling. I would say things like my heart rate is elevated, or I'm shaking, or I'm sweating, or I feel a lump in my throat. I only understood my experience of emotion in terms of my physiological reaction. And so my therapist prodded me to expand upon it, to label it with an emotion. She wanted to know what I was emotionally feeling. And I was verbalizing all this stuff like, oh, I don't know if what I felt was anger, but what I do know is, again, my heart rate elevated. I had a pit in my stomach. And she was like, did that feel like anger? And I was like, I'm not sure. Like, did it feel like anger? And with enough pushing, I was finally able to put a label on what I was feeling. So in the past, before I had that breakthrough, I would rank myself very highly on this question. Now I'm better, I think. I don't think I'm perfect, but I think I am better at identifying what I feel. I'm very good at knowing what I think. A lot of my job is thinking. A lot of who I am as a person is thinking. But in terms of what I feel, getting better, not great, but getting better. I'd rate myself a 4. I feel as if I don't know myself very well. I don't think that describes me at all. I think I do know, and I think I have known who I am, or at least I feel that way. And, you know, these questions are exactly that. It's for you to ask yourself what you feel, as if there isn't like an objective truth. How do you feel about knowing yourself? And I feel like I do know myself very well. I think I've lived with myself long enough. I feel like I've done enough introspection to know the different facets of my personality and how I react in certain situations. I'm not that surprised at myself anymore, but occasionally I'll I don't know, like get really mad at something that I didn't think that I was ever going to get mad about. And so in those moments, I still feel like there's more research or reflection to be done. So I'm going to give myself a 3, right? Does not describe me mostly. Number 3, I feel out of touch with the real me. This one feels like it's got such a heavy weight, like out of touch. No, I think I am in this stage of my life pretty in touch with the real me. I don't think I know myself 100%. I don't think that that's necessarily possible, but I feel like I'm in sync with who I am as a person. So I'm going to say I'm a 2. And number 4, they just go ahead and say it. I feel alienated from myself. I don't think I really feel alienated from myself at all. So I'm going to have that as a 1. So I'm going to go ahead and I am going to actually average or total. I don't actually know. I don't actually know what they do in the paper. I don't have that recorded in my notes. But I'm going to just sum it up anyway, and then we can compare notes. Rather, like, you can share your own results, but you don't have to. I'll share mine. In category 1, I got a 21 out of a possible 28. Category 2, an 11 out of 28. And category 3, a 10 out of 28. So this scale, what do we use it for? Or what is the purpose of using this scale, right? Besides just a little bit of a neat reflection tool, does this data actually mean anything, or could it mean something? And I will get to that when I record this data. 1886. 1886480. Ooh, we might have a new low. Ooh, that is abysmal. That is 0.03%. Yeah, a Canada start is really rough. But the next start is going to be in the UK, so let's see how we fare there. Oh god, I'm fudging it. Oh god. I'm an American. My geography is not great. Anyway, so we have these numbers. We have some level of reflection of how we understand these different facets of authenticity. So what can we actually do with it? So in the paper, the authors seek to sort of cross-validate these questions with other aspects of life, things like big 5 personality traits, anxiety, stress levels, and it appears the way that you would expect it to appear. Category 1, authentic living, is correlated with less stress, less anxiety, and better life satisfaction. And the other two categories are negatively correlated with those same things, right? So the more you accept external influence and the more you are self-alienated, the less satisfied you are with life, the more stressed you are, the more anxiety you have. And, to me, that's not that interesting on its face, right? You would kind of expect that to be the case. But what I find interesting is I find myself asking how valid this scale is across different cultures. Because again, one of the red flags that was raised in this conversation about authenticity is this idea that different cultures have different relationships with external influence, right? So in a culture with high cultural homogeneity and where people are generally more nosy and more controlling over their societal expectations, is this idea of accepting external influence not matter as much? And so other researchers have taken this authenticity scale and used it all over the world. So the free one online, the paper that is open to the public, I believe replicates this data in a Russian sample. And it also capitulates the data here. So it looks like the authenticity scale works the same in a Russian sample. I don't know too much about Russian culture and how heavy the social context is in that part of the world, but I do know that at least in China, there are heavy societal influences that can feel suffocating for some people. In fact, I have heard through the grapevine, some people from China, part of the appeal of being in America is this idea that Americans are just less nosy. That's not to say that America is all free love and you can do whatever here. Of course, we have our heavy set cultural influences here too, but you can put some distance between you and your neighbor depending on where you are in America. right? And so my hypothesis was that this authenticity scale might not be that effective, or might not look like, or might get different data than in China than in the US. And so I looked up if this paper had been replicated in China, and it has, and apparently this authenticity scale works very similarly in China. So it might not matter what your dominant cultural background is. This idea of having to tussle with accepting external influence seems to be a universal thing that gets in the way of being, quote unquote, your true authentic self. And it's also important to note that, oh, interesting. It's also important to note that this is, of course, not objective, right? These are surveys. It's people's own reflections of what they perceive themselves to be. So whether or not people are actually accepting influence is not you can't measure that. But what you can measure is how they feel or how they think about whether or not they're accepting influence. So I think that's an important distinction to make. So it's interesting that this data had been replicated in different cultural contexts, which suggests that maybe there's some sort of universality in our conception of authenticity, which I think is cool. But I think another aspect of this paper, and I'm not entirely sure I can show it, again, because I don't want to publish copyrighted material to the public. It's not really my place. Although, if you ask the authors, I'm sure that they would be happy to send you a copy. But what I have come to see is that in this initial paper where they come up with this questionnaire, this authenticity scale, that they did this in several different samples, and I don't entirely remember what the different contexts of those samples were, but I was interested to see in the variability in the data and what that tells us about how reliable the three factors of authentic living, accepting external influence, and self-alienation are. By far, the strongest correlative coefficients were associated with authentic living and self-alienation, right? I think it's not really that surprising if you feel like you are self-alienated, if you feel like you don't really know yourself. It's not surprising that maybe you would be generally a more anxious person, or not as happy or satisfied with your life. So I'm recording the data from this run. 251, 126, 443. Right, it's not exactly a leap of faith to suggest that if you don't feel like yourself, I mean, I think that's tragic and very sad. It just makes a lot of sense that you would be overall not as happy. So that, in a way, is good validation for the truthfulness of the model, I think. Also, your conception of authenticity coming from authentic living. You know, if you are spending less mental APM living according to a way that you don't feel you should be behaving, you know, it just makes sense that the more you act authentically, the more happy or less anxious that you would be. But accepting external influence actually has the least strong correlation with those measures of these three layers, right? So in one particular sample of 100 people, accepting external influence was actually not correlated with satisfaction with life. In the other three samples that they did, it was negatively correlated, meaning the more that you feel like you accept external influence, the less satisfied they appear to be. But it wasn't true for every sample. And I'm kind of kicking myself because I did not find out what that sample, if that sample was different in any kind of way. But it does give us an idea that, at least for some people, this idea of accepting external influence does not necessarily negatively affect one's own idea of whether or not somebody is satisfied with their life, right? And I think that's kind of what I was getting at when this idea of authenticity was first brought to my attention, right? Some of us accept external influence because the external influence just works for us. I mean, I am in many ways not or well suited, I guess, easily molded into the expectations that society sets out for me. But that's not necessarily true for everybody, and that's no fault of their own. I just happen to be the way that I happen to be, and what I happen to be is right in the middle of the bell curve for a lot of parameters, right? So accepting external influence doesn't actually bother me that much. And that might not be the same for every person, right? I mean, one good, say, in a lot of parts of the world, in a lot of periods of time, in a lot of contexts, for example, who you chose to take as a lover is partially influenced by the culture that you grew up with. Whether or not you feel like you can express that authenticity is going to be difficult in certain contexts. And so that may very well have a negative effect on your anxiety, your stress, your satisfaction with life. And so I think that fits, right? That is a good example and helps us understand a bit more about the working parts of what authenticity means. So I don't think that, again, I'm not a guru, I'm not a professional in any kind of way. So, I think this is just interesting. It's just an interesting mental exercise. I mean, maybe you can talk about it with your therapist in the future. Maybe that's the use. I wouldn't take too much of what I say as advice. But thinking about the ways in which you can be happier, more satisfied with life might come in thinking about the context in which you express your own authenticity, right? The other important thing to know is this paper, I don't think, makes the argument that authenticity is either a cause or effect of being happy, right? These are correlations. Correlations could go either way or neither way, right? It's tempting to assume that, oh, if I just live more authentically, I'm going to be happier. And certainly that might be the case, right? That very well may be the case. I don't exactly know how one would test that, but you could interpret it that way. The other way that you could interpret it, if we're talking about correlation, is this idea that maybe what it is that once your life circumstances get to a point where you can express yourself or live authentically, then that changing in circumstance is what makes you happier, right? So the order of operations might be slightly different. Either you start living more authentically and you get the joy from that, and you're satisfied and your stress levels go down or whatever. Or maybe you move to a different location, you move to a different country, you get a new friend group, and all of a sudden, that environment is a lot more accepting of who you are, and then you start to feel happier, and that happiness and the feeling of safety enables you to live more authentically. And then maybe that's the relationship between the two, and maybe it's a combination of both. Maybe it's one or the other for certain people. I don't think that this paper makes that argument either way. But that is an important aspect to acknowledge, right? This is not a prescriptive tool. It's a neat, reflective questionnaire, or at least that's what I'm using it for, right? Oh, all right. So I'm going to take a little break while I record this data, and I'll say just a couple of more things about authenticity. This crying lady might be experiencing some constraints in her environment that might prevent her from having life satisfaction, namely a huge pandemic. 601 475 982. That is 8%, so pretty good, but it's going to be pretty hard to beat our PB from here on out, I think. That 14% the other day was truly, truly wild. All right, next couple of starting locations are actually all going to be in China. That's just how the dice roll, right? Okay, so I want to return back to the conversation of expressing authenticity, right? So there's this idea that, oh, if you're not acting authentically, that you must not be authentic, or you might be a fake person. And I think this is what really triggered this initial conversation that made me so mad, is the person flaunting their own authenticity is in ways assigning a moral value to acting in a way that is congruent with your conception of self, right? And that rubbed me in the wrong way. Like, I don't think that that is true. Just because you bring your shirt and shoes to a restaurant so that you can eat doesn't mean that you are acting inauthentically or fake. I think that's way too silly. And it's something that I've mentioned a couple times in the stream already. But what I think is important to take away from this is that expression of your authenticity is context-based, right? So not only do you have different contexts, you have different friends, different families, and there are different codes and modes of being that you inhabit that all appropriately describe you, but also factors in your environment might make you feel unsafe to act in the way that you want to act. And there's no clearer way for me to illustrate this than by recounting plenty of times where I am met with people I am unfamiliar with and I completely shut down. Like, I have this story where I was interviewing for graduate stem cell school, right? And in the interview, I was overwhelmed by an environment that I was unfamiliar with, because I think if I were to describe my authentic self, I think I'm a pretty interesting person to talk to. I think that I can hold the conversation and we can both get something out of it, because I think that I am good at finding the thing that you want to talk about and then talking about it. And I think that I can engage with you intellectually to the point where I can find a lot of things interesting, as long as the person conveying that information to me is passionate about conveying that information. So if you are very passionate about 16th century sculptures and are ranting to me about it, I think I could probably have a good conversation with you, just because I really like that energy. I also happen to think that in certain contexts that I am quite funny, although you might not get that from these Plague Ink streams where I just drone on and on about things that I like or want to think about. But I think I'm only funny in the context of the people whose senses of humor I understand and share, right? I am not a comedian, but I think I know what my friends would laugh at, and I like to inhabit the space of making people laugh. But in this interview space where I'm surrounded by a ton of like mini geniuses all competing to go to the same graduate school, I shut down to the point where in the middle of this like very fancy dinner, I had to take multiple bathroom breaks and just sit in a bathroom stall and just take deep, deep breaths, just finding the space to reset my mentality, because inhabiting the space of someone who really wants to go to this school but doesn't want to come off as a weirdo is kind of taxing. And so one could argue, if you're living authentically, why do you care what other people think? Like, if they can't accept the real you, why would you want to go there? You're just forcing yourself into a mold that might not accept you to begin with. And yes, I do acknowledge that there is that personality, but there's also, again, a social context for these things. it's not always appropriate to, you know, come into your grad school interview and meet a bunch of people you don't know and just start off by being like, hey, you know what I want to talk about? I want to talk about the Boogie the Boogie documentary, right? Like I want to get deep into YouTube drama, right? Like sometimes it is appropriate if you're not feeling safe to, you know, go at your own pace. You don't have to dump all your crap onto somebody if you feel like they're going to be bored by it, because, you know, nobody wins there. That's not to say that you fake it entirely, right? You have to try, I think. You have to try to show a little bit of yourself in these contexts, right? Like, and you roll it out in order. You roll it out in order of what you think people would accept. So I'm not telling you to fake it, right? Don't fake, don't be. I think what we can take away from this authentic living paper is that extended periods of time of acting inauthentically are probably maybe associated with you not being as happy with your life as you could be. And I think that is reasonable. So I'm not telling you to fake it. I'm telling you, you can be yourself, but you can also be smart about how you are yourself. And I think for me, that was a big lesson that I had to teach myself, right? So what I mean by you can reveal yourself in order is, you know, you send a couple feelers out for what people might want to talk about, you know, like if you're in that unfamiliar people situation where conversations are very surface level, you know, you talk about sports or hobbies, you know, stuff that it's not terribly interesting, but is important. It plays an important function in the development of your eventual relationships with people, because you get to slowly kind of figure out who these people are and if you'll mesh, right? You probably don't jump straight into the fact that, oh, you know what I did last Saturday? I spent 9 hours watching YouTube drama video essays. Right, that's maybe a little esoteric, so I wouldn't roll that out quite yet until you start talking about something that's adjacent, you know, more acceptable than weird internet drama holes. Maybe you talk about YouTube, right? Or like, what kind of YouTube content do you like to watch, you know? Maybe you don't start with drama YouTubers, maybe you start with something else, right? There's a way to remain authentic, but to remain tactful, I think. You could also argue that this idea of tact is a societal pressure. Like, who says you have to be tactful? Certainly true, but I think it's just if you want to maximize or if you want to minimize the people you prematurely turn away, that might be the smarter strategy, right? There's this idea of false positives, meaning a result is positive but is actually negative, or false negative where it looks negative but is actually positive. By being tactful in the way that you roll yourself out to people, you'll get fewer false negatives, right? People that you would have otherwise had a good connection with, but you said something too weird too quickly. Yeah. So, that's mostly what I have to say about authenticity. I think that I'm going to continue to think, oh no, actually it isn't. I have one more thing to say, one more story. So this idea of authenticity, I think dovetails really well with this idea of self-discovery, right? Because how can you live authentically if you don't know who you are, right? If you don't know who you are, how can you live authentically? So the question then becomes, how do I figure out who I am? And I think that's a question for your therapist. I think that's definitely true, but from anecdotal evidence from people that I know, one way to really find who you are as a person is to date. And I mean date people that you don't know, meeting strangers. And so why or how does that contribute to your own perception of self or understanding of self? And the understanding of self comes from the fact that when you're on dates, there will often be times where the other person does something so crazy that you're forced to have an opinion on something, or you're forced to emotionally react in some kind of fashion, right? So, you know, if you're out on a date and somebody, the person that you are seeing, if they chew with their mouth open, you're probably going to have an opinion on that. You might not have had an opinion on that before, but when you see some crazy stuff, you learn a little bit more about yourself. And that doesn't always mean that it's going to be bad, right? You don't just learn things that you don't like about people, although that can often happen on dates with strangers, but you also learn what you like, right? Like, if somebody is particularly charming in a certain context or has a certain sense of humor, you learn just by experiencing and reflecting on what you feel, what you liked about that interaction. And so I think that puts into context this idea of self-discovery. And yeah, so if some wild stuff happens to you on a date, that's a great way to figure out what you don't like and like real quick. And that is actually a nice transition into something that I was alluding to earlier, and that's who I was when I was younger. And part of that fear of experiencing emotion and wanting to minimize my occupied space in other people's lives, like I was very conscious to not be a burden to other people. And I think I got that from my grandma, right? Like my grandma, I have this memory of her and her sister, so my great aunt, and we're taking the bus together, and there's one priority seating spot left on the bus, and my grandma started wrestling her sister into that chair, right? This like permanently putting yourself second kind of mentality. I think I got that from my grandma. I made a joke in one of my videos that like being told that you that like asking for seconds is rude is like a slippery slope many years later to believing that, you know, you would rather die than ask for help because that would burden somebody, right? I have no shame in asking for help, but I do have a worry that I am occupying time and energy that somebody could be using for something better with that now. But there are still moments when I'm out at somebody's home and I need to go to the bathroom, and there's still that voice in my head that tells me to just deal with it, to not burden them with pointing out the location of the restroom, right? Like I know objectively that that's not a big deal, but there is sometimes still that voice that makes it so that I don't want to be a burden. And it was so extreme that in like it's the other half of like not recognizing my own emotions. The other half of that is not having emotional opinions. So likes, dislikes, etc. There were like cognitive things that I liked. Cognitive, I like biology. I like talking about this, and that, and I don't like olives. So like it's not that. It's when looking for a partner to share life with, I think I was a little afraid to have negative opinions, because having icks or negative opinions would narrow the dating pool, right? Like that's again putting myself second. Like if I'm just accepting of everybody, then that maximizes the chance that I find somebody. And I think that's purposefully keeping a part of yourself obscured and getting in the way of knowing yourself. But interestingly, at the time, I don't think I would have been self-aware enough to actually know that about myself. It's only in retrospect that I could grade myself badly on that scale. So I almost wonder if there needs to be like a fourth category, but there's never going to be a fourth category, right? I was thinking like these data that you generate from doing this authenticity scale are only as good as your own understanding of yourself. Like, I thought that I had a good understanding of my thoughts and opinions, but only looking back to those earlier years do I realize that I was purposely keeping myself away from developing certain opinions and an understanding of myself. So back then I probably would have rated myself quite low, and now I'm rating myself a little higher just because I understand more of myself. So that's an interesting, what do I want to call it? Confounding aspect. But I don't think you can correct for that. I'm not sure it's possible, because if you really don't know yourself, how do you measure how much you don't know yourself? You would have to know that you don't know yourself, and you can't do that. So that may be where we get stuck in terms of figuring that puzzle out. But with that, I hope I have given you some head toys to play with. I don't know really what to call it. Some, yeah, just some thoughts to play with. I think that maybe you'll find them interesting. And if you did, let me know. What do you think? Because I think it's a fun conversation. Get to think about yourself, get to think about who you are. For some people that's terrifying, but I think it's always interesting and worth doing. And with that, I am going to end the stream. I wish you all, for those of you who celebrate, a lovely Thanksgiving. I'm releasing a Thanksgiving short the morning of Thanksgiving, the morning of Thursday, at least in my time zone. Be sure to watch that if you want to know how much turkey you would need to eat to pass out. So look forward to that. I hope to see you next time, where I talk about some other random thing that I want to talk about.